Well, firstly, let me thank Father Obi and Dr. Lewis for the invitation and the warm welcome. Let me thank all of you for being here today to discuss this important initiative. I think it's a really fantastic first step, as Dr. Obi said, Father Obi said, to bring together government, communities, and civil society. I think that the actors working together can achieve so much more than working independently. Let me just begin with an apology, though. I was hoping to be with you all in person today, but I've had some delays getting my visa from the Nigerian High Commission here in the UK. So unfortunately, I've had to push back my travel to Nigeria by a few days. I had hoped very much to be with you in person, and I apologize for that, but I'm grateful to the organizers for facilitating my participation online. So I'm very glad to be with you, even though I'm sad I can't join you in person. And thank you all so much for attending. Let me also thank the organizers, TrustAfrica and ECOSGF and AfriTAL, for inviting SDN to partner in this initiative, which we very much welcome. For those of you who don't know SDN, I hope many of you do, but for those of you who don't, just to say we're a charity operating in the Niger Delta, where we've been for 20 years, and we focused over many years on working with communities on the affected by the operations of the oil and gas sector. For instance, we created the oil spill monitor, gas flare tracker, which are now widely used as monitoring tools within the government of Nigeria, and so beyond. Today, as I said, I think it's a really fantastic opportunity to look at one of the most pressing environmental challenges of our time, which is around methane abatement. Now, I'll just say I don't speak as a climate scientist or a technologist, but I do speak as someone who's worked for many years at the intersection of climate change with environmental and social justice, both with the United Nations and now with SDN. And in these short remarks today, what I hope to do is just to give a bit of a scene setter for some of the discussions which will come later, and introduce some of the questions that I hope the panel and other experts we have with us today will be exploring further. So I'll be touching mainly on the kind of global landscape around methane emissions, though I will briefly also consider some of the major policies in Nigeria at present. I do have a few slides I'd like to share with you, which I will try and do so now. I very much hope you can see them. Let me just try and bring those up. Let me know if you can see these slides. Yeah, is that a yes? I think I can see them on the screen. I hope you can see them. Okay, so I'll proceed, assuming you can see them. So, in terms of what I hope to cover today, can you see the second slide with the overview? Yeah. Father Obi, can you see that? Colleagues in the room? Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'll basically frame today's remarks around three questions. Why should methane abatement be a priority for us globally and for Nigeria? What do we know about the sources of methane? What are some of the gaps in monitoring and reporting around methane emissions in Nigeria? And then, how can we go about reducing methane? What are some of the steps we could start thinking about and taking? So, why is methane abatement a priority? I think there's really three aspects to this. One is the climate change impacts of methane. Secondly, the public health impacts of methane and associated activities. And thirdly, local environmental impacts. So there's three real prongs or three real benefits to potentially mitigating methane. So firstly, let's just explore methane's role in climate change. Some of you will be very familiar with this, but it's always helpful just to go back to some of the numbers and data to just to get a baseline. This picture here you can see shows all the man-made greenhouse gas emissions globally from 1990 up to 2019. The blue and the yellow there is CO2, which is obviously the main focus when we talk about climate change. But that significant red bar there is methane emissions. So you'll see methane emissions around 20%, around 1/5 of total greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very significant player. But not only is it a significant chunk of methane emissions, but because methane is a very effective heat trapping gas, far more effective, in fact, than CO2, it plays a disproportionate role in global climate change. This slide shows from the IPCC, shows the estimated impact of all different greenhouse gases on the total warming we've seen to date. So those red bars are gases or chemicals which have pushed up warming, and some of the blue ones are emissions which have pulled down warming. And you see they net off with the total warming we've seen to date, which is about 1 or 1.5 degrees. And you see the total warming from methane, which is highlighted in that box, is about 2/3 of the warming we've seen from carbon dioxide. So although it's only about 20% of total greenhouse gas emissions, its impact on global warming is disproportionate. And that's because it's a much more effective heat trapping gas, around 80 times more effective over a 20-year period than CO2. But the good news is that because methane only stays in the atmosphere for a relatively short time, if you cut methane emissions, you can actually have quite a quick impact on climate, in contrast to CO2, which stays in the atmosphere for much longer. And therefore, even if you're making reductions, you don't see the benefit of that for many years to come. So obviously, methane is going to have a huge role in global climate change. And you see increasingly the global climate change conversation is focusing not just on CO2, but methane. In fact, President Biden at COP26 said methane reduction was the single most effective strategy we have to slow global warming in the near term. So it's really at the top of the international agenda. And I'll look at some of the international initiatives in this space a little bit later. But as I said, the benefits from methane abatement aren't just about connecting to climate change. There are also public health benefits potentially, and impacts on human health. Now, methane can impact on human health through various pathways. There's the direct impacts and also the indirect impacts through climate change. For example, while methane isn't directly toxic, we know it can be linked to the formation of ground level ozone and particulate pollution, both of which themselves have significant health implications and can be linked to a range of health problems, including respiratory issues, cardiovascular diseases, and premature deaths. Ground level ozone can aggravate lung diseases, trigger asthma, and increase rates of preterm births. So we do also know that communities living near sources of methane emissions, particularly oil and gas operations, where the flaring and so on takes place, also suffer the consequences of that through things like acidification, acid rain, and so on. So there's direct and indirect benefits to methane abatement in terms of public health, and as well as the global environmental impacts, which we've talked about through climate change. There's also local environmental impacts from methane as well on local plants and wildlife. And we see, methane emissions can lead to the acidification of aquatic environments, changing the chemistry of water bodies, and affecting species that live there, and so on. So, in summary, methane abatement really needs to be at the top of the agenda because of those big short-term climate change benefits, but also the public health and local environmental benefits from methane abatement. Let me touch now briefly a little bit on the sources of methane, what we know about that, and also some of the gaps in what we know. So, methane, of course, can arise from natural processes as well as man-made anthropogenic processes. The current estimates are about 60% of the methane emissions every year are from human emissions. And I think Father Obi touched on some of the sources of these already. But the estimates are that, agriculture is the biggest single source of methane, particularly enteric emissions, that's digestive emissions mainly from cows, cattle, After agriculture, as well as rice farming and so on. After that, energy is the biggest contributor, around 35%, and then waste management, landfills, are also a big source of methane. And within that energy sector, emissions, oil and gas is by far the largest, as that picture shows. However, it should be said that we don't really have very, very accurate estimates of methane sources. And here you can see this chart. There's attempts to gauge the total methane emissions from Nigeria in different studies. And there's a really quite big variation between those estimates. You'll see the top one is the Nigeria's Greenhouse Gas Inventory 2021. The bottom one is the IEA Methane Tracker, and a few other studies in the middle there by academics and others. And there's really quite wide variation in scale of total methane emissions in Nigeria, which suggests that we need better data and improved studies to really get a good grip on what the different sources of methane are, so that we can start putting in place more effective abatement policies. I mean, just to give you a picture of what we think we might know, the UNFCCC estimates from 2017, looking at Nigeria, suggested about 66% of man-made emissions from Nigeria were from the agriculture, forestry, land use category, with about 23% from waste, and the rest from energy and other processes. But other studies have given different figures. Let me move on from this. So, how are we going to improve? Our knowledge about the accuracy of methane emissions? One promising development is the growing use of satellite data to do estimates of methane emissions. We have various satellites already operating. A few of them are listed here. For example, the Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-5P satellites have been providing free data on methane emissions for a few years. But we're going to see a big step forward in the next few months with the launch of MethaneSat, which is a new satellite funded by the Environmental Defense Fund in the US. It was launched a few weeks ago, so it's now in orbit, and we should start seeing data from it by the end of the year, possibly early next year. Now, what MethaneSat will do is will give, it's a satellite specifically targeted at methane emissions, so it will give both quite accurate data in terms of the resolution on a geographic basis, and also quite frequent coverage over a wide geographical spread. So that will really add to the kind of baseline data we already have and give us, I think, a much improved picture of methane emissions. I should note a couple of initiatives in this area. So the United Nations Environment Programme is working with the Federal Ministry of Environment and the National Council of Climate Change in Nigeria. I think maybe we have some colleagues here today who may be involved in that. And they're going to be using satellite studies to produce a more accurate baseline of emissions data by sector in Nigeria over the next year or two. So I'm hopeful that over the next few years we'll see much more accurate data coming out, which will help us refine our understanding of the sources of methane and start to develop more detailed abatement policies. Just a couple of images you can see from existing satellites. This is the Sentinel one on the left, which is freely available, but it doesn't give you a very high resolution at present. You can get more accurate data from commercial satellites. This is the GHG South on the right, much more accurate in terms of a spatial level, but it's quite expensive because that's commercial data. So it's not always practical for policymakers who want to do countrywide studies or studies across a whole area to pay for that data, which ends up being very expensive if you want to cover a very wide area. For example, to get countrywide baselines. Just to add one other initiative in this area that SDN is involved with, we've been working with NOSDRA, the National Oil Spill Detection Response Agency, to build a prototype methane tracker, which we hope to have operational, at least in a prototype form, in the next couple of months. What this will do is basically take some of the freely available satellite data that's already there, and also overlay it with infrastructure data on oil and gas facilities, so that you can start to see patterns in terms of where large emission detection, large methane emission plumes, for example, are being seen in relation to different pieces of infrastructure, which will then help regulators work with industry to improve their response. And we hope that this tool will be flexible, so as new satellites come available, new data becomes available, that can be integrated and the tool can be improved, so you get more accurate readings, which will help you really drill down and see the sources of methane in more detail. So in summary, we think that agriculture looks like by far the biggest sector for methane emissions globally, probably also in Nigeria, with the energy sector a very important second, and waste management an important third. We're improving the understanding of the sources of those emissions using satellite data, but there are still some gaps which need to be further improved on. I mean, other caveats around satellite data, obviously it doesn't work when there's a lot of clouds, which can be a problem over the Niger Delta. You can lose readings because of cloud cover. And also satellite data doesn't always work very well for offshore emissions, because sunlight reflecting off the sea can interfere with the measurements. So there are some caveats around satellite data. It's not perfect, but it's a very useful tool, and I think it will continue to improve. So we've looked a little bit at why it's important to abate methane, and also some of the data around sources, and what can be done there. So now maybe turn a little bit to what are some effective policies, or what are some of the responses which are in place at the moment, and what more can be done. It's worth saying, there's a number of major global initiatives on methane. Many of you will be aware of these, starting back in the year 2000 with the Global Methane Initiative, and then more recently, we've seen in 2020 the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, which is led by the World Bank, and then the Global Methane Pledge in 2021, which was launched at COP26, and now has support from 111 countries, representing at least 45% of global man-made methane. And under that Global Methane Pledge, there's a commitment from those countries to reduce methane emissions by at least 30% below 2020 levels by 2030. So there's a lot going on in the international space. The World Bank also has the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership, as I mentioned, and the United Nations Environment Programme, collaboration with the Climate Clean Air Coalition, has various initiatives on methane as well. For example, the MARS system, that's the methane response system, which is providing some of that satellite data I mentioned earlier. So there's quite a lot going on at the global level. And there's a lot of advice on policy as well being developed. This is a very interesting chart, if I could just pause on this for a moment. Basically looking at what the cost on methane abatement is. So this was prepared by the International Energy Agency, and they basically looked at all the different types of interventions you could take mainly in the oil and gas sector to reduce methane, and whether those reductions would pay for themselves in terms of recovering methane, which could then be sold, or whether it would actually require a net investment. And you can see that almost half, so all to the left of the chart, all those bars which are below the line are actually interventions which would pay for themselves, because the methane which is leaking or is otherwise wasted through flaring could be captured and sold to generate economic value. So you can see that nearly half of all the interventions they estimated would actually be positive cost for operators. This is, I think, a really important point, that actually, we're not talking about necessarily having to spend a lot of money, which we won't recover. Actually, a lot of methane abatement interventions are net positive and would basically pay for themselves. So I guess the question mark there comes, if these are net positive in terms of cost, why are they not being done already? And I think there's a few problems here. One is a lack of information, lack of awareness around emissions levels, or if you don't know if methane is leaking undetected, obviously companies then won't be aware of that. Also, maybe a lack of awareness around the cost effectiveness of some of these different interventions. Another barrier can be inadequate infrastructure or underdeveloped local markets that make it difficult to sell the gas once it's recovered or find a productive use for it. And then also you have misaligned investment incentives arising from competition for capital within companies or insufficiently quick payback from some of these interventions. So there's a number of problems which need to be overcome if some of these very cost-effective methane abatement measures are going to be implemented. But if we can overcome those, the benefits are really enormous. So, what are some of those interventions that are in here? There's things like replacing existing devices, oil and gas value chains, retrofitting infrastructure with lower emitting versions, things like installing emissions control devices, vapor recovery units, compressors to capture emissions and so on before they build up across the oil and gas supply chain. And then obviously leak detection and repair. When methane is leaking, is undetected, then obviously it's very hard to capture that or to mitigate that. So yes, lots of opportunities there, which can be cost effective and net positive if some of those barriers can be overcome. I'll just very briefly touch on some of Nigeria's policy commitments in relation to methane. Many of you in the room are more expert than I am on these, but Nigeria, I think, has set out some quite ambitious targets in a number of different policy documents. There's obviously the Energy Transition Plan, Nigeria's Nationally Determined Contributions, the short-lived Climate Pollutants Central Action Plan, and UPRC's worked on methane guidelines and so on. There's some pretty big commitments in some of those places. For example, the commitment to eliminate flaring by 2030 and to achieve a 50% reduction in fugitive emissions by 2031. So I think the framework is there in terms of major commitments. I guess the question is now really, how do we move from setting targets to actually delivery and implementation? A few things I think would be really important in that respect. One, improving the monitoring and data, which we've already talked about, which can be part of coordinated action. Secondly, making sure that gas commercialization program, gas flare commercialization, which has been in the works for many years, but yet I don't think to date has got as far as it could do. Making sure that that's fully implemented, making progress on venting, and then the final point, which I think is why we gathered today a little bit, making sure there's more public awareness and the civil society communities are working together more closely on this and understand the potential of methane abatement, but also we can develop interventions that really benefit communities at the local level. For example, through that gas flare commercialization, can be developed, local power sources so that communities see a benefit to health and environment in terms of reducing gas flaring, but B, also maybe see local power generated for that community so they can benefit from methane which is captured rather than just being flared off. So let me pause there and just thank you all for listening. I hope that's a sort of useful overview, a little bit of some of the global picture, and hopefully picked up some themes that can be explored further on today. Looking forward to hearing from all of you and participating in some of the discussions as well later on. So thank you once again for the invite, and I very much commend this initiative and looking forward to engaging with you as we go forward. So thanks again.
Let me sincerely appreciate you for your presentation. I'm aware that SDN has been doing a lot in oil and gas, and that SDN developed, if I'm correct, developed the gas flare tracker, which is of immense help to oil and gas. When you also talked about trying to develop similar equipment, I just wonder if, for instance, we'll be able to separate, for instance, data collected from anthropogenic sources and from that of oil and gas, maybe as we move on. That's number one. While thanking you for the special interest on this project, I just want to look at the room, whether there is any question for you, so that you can just talk to that I just dropped.
Thank you for your presentation. I have just a concern here. From literature, it's clear that we have about 4 or more basic methods for methane removal: the thermal catalytic oxidation process, photocatalytic oxidation process, and the biological methane removal process. The first one is the concentration of methane with zeolites and other porous materials, and subsequent separation using membranes. And that's what some of the IOCs have leveraged on, and government is also looking at that. Now, all these 4 can be effected using top-notch technologies. My question and concern here is, who will bear the cost for these new technologies and practices? While, as we stand now, we're still having challenges of governance with respect to methane abatement and other climate change issues. Thank you.
Important question is around who bears the costs for investing in the technologies that will effectively abate methane. And I think it's, yeah, that's the really
that's correct.
That's the really critical question. And I think, ultimately, obviously there is some funding available from the World Bank and so on and others, but the scale of funding that will be required, it will ultimately have to come from the private sector, and from international energy companies will have to invest in this technology. So I think the gentleman who raised the question said given the governance challenges already effective in managing that industry in Nigeria, how can we be confident this will take place? I'm not sure there's a great answer for that. What I would point to is that a lot of these, as the point I think I covered on the slides, methane abatement cost curve, is that a lot of these investments actually pay for themselves if you get the right investment framework, right policy framework. Companies can actually make money by investing in methane abatement, capture the gas and sell it commercially, either for power generation or for other uses. So I think that's the place that we need to start from, is looking which of the interventions are most likely to be cost effective for companies, and then really drilling down into what the barriers are, because these should be in companies' self-interest to make these changes. So we need to, if they're not doing it by their own volition, we need to really drill down into what the barriers are, whether they're policy barriers in the market, in the capital markets, or whatever it might be, to try and map out in more detail exactly what's preventing companies taking measures which improve their bottom line. So I don't have a magic bullet for that. And I think the gentleman's absolutely right that it's all part of the broader governance system, which we know can be challenging. But I think as a starting point, looking at those interventions, investments that companies could make, which would actually be of commercial value, is the place to start for the quickest, easiest wins. So that would be my short response. I hope that's of some help. I think, Dr. Louis, you asked a question about the methane tracking tool that SDN is trying to develop. So just to say a little bit more about that one. So we're working with Nostra on this, building on the success of the gas flare tracker. What the gas flare tracker did is it basically uses heat signatures, because obviously when you burn off gas, it produces a lot of heat, which satellites can pick up. So the gas flare tracker, and you can assume that when there's gas flaring, there's probably also methane being leaked as well, because the burning isn't 100% efficient. So the gas flare tracker provides a very rough indication of where some places where there might be methane. But what we're trying to do is to use satellites that actually specifically look not just at heat signatures, but at methane emissions themselves. As I said, there's already some free data out there. It's not perfect. It doesn't give you very accurate geographical spatial readings, but it's better than nothing. And once you start to put that data together with some of the infrastructure data, you can see, okay, we have a very big methane emissions over 6 months in this area. That's where this particular processing facility is, or that's where this particular pipeline is. And you can start to maybe make some of those correlations, and then the regulators will work with some of the oil companies to make sure they have proper plans in place for addressing any of those fugitive methane leaks, or identifying what the source of the methane is. And as the satellite data improves and we get this new methane sat data in the next few months, I think that will be a big opportunity to take that tool and develop it further and make it a really quite an accurate tool that regulators can use. As I said as well, the United Nations Environment Programme is just embarking on a baseline study looking at the different sectors in Nigeria to try and pull together all the data that's currently available and get a much more accurate baseline assessment of what's coming from agriculture, what's coming from the oil and gas sector, what's coming from landfill, etc. So I think over the next year or two we might have a more accurate picture. We hope that our tool, we're not going to be generating new data. It's more about taking the data which is already freely available and combining it with other data on infrastructure and so on to produce something which is helpful to government, to regulators, and hopefully to researchers and civil society and others. So that's where we hope to go with that prototype. We're hoping that will be available to at least in an initial version in maybe June. And then we'll continue to, if we can get further funding, we'll continue to improve it over the coming months. Thank you. I hope that answered the questions, and happy to take any more for this in.